This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of A Silent Voice and What is Obscenity. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys, well, not necessarily with PhDs, but who have a stake in higher education talking about manga. And on the June episode of the manga series, Shea and I are going to be talking about a couple of interesting titles. We're going to begin with Yoshitoki Oima's A Silent Voice, all 7 volumes of that. And then we're going to wrap up with What is Obscenity, the story of a good-for-nothing artist and her pussy by Rokudenashiko. But before we get to those titles, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some wonderful specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but often the discounts can get more impressive than that.
Like in June, you can get the Pride and Prejudice manga for 25% off, or you can get the Nijigahara Holograph by Inio Asano, who we've talked about on the show, for 30% off.
That's right. You know, if you like your comics in manga form or otherwise, you couldn't do better than going to Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your manga pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your stuff there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. So, Shea, we got a couple of interesting titles to discuss this month. One is rather provocative, and so let's go ahead and get to that.
All right.
Now, the first title that we're going to be discussing is Yoshitoki Oima's A Silent Voice. This has just recently wrapped up, at least the English editions, back in late May. In fact, the 7th and final volume of A Silent Voice was released in the U.S. on May 31st of this year. So this is relatively a fresh series for many U.S. English readers. We also should mention that this is a title that you and I decided to discuss because we had heard so many good things about it. And in fact, a friend of the show, someone who takes part in our on-location shows often, Matthew Cusio, said that he really liked this. And so I thought that I'd recommend it, and you had heard good things about it as well.
Yeah, it was one I had seen. I think in English, there's not a whole lot of really good writing about manga, about Japanese comics. You'll see some good stuff at, like, the Comics Journal, but beyond that, there's not a lot. But A Silent Voice was kind of a series I had seen some pretty solid things said about, and some pretty interesting writing about, particularly as it relates to its kind of depiction of a disabled character, of a deaf character. And so I was really excited when you had proposed reading it, because it was something that I had read a lot about, and I was kind of interested in. So it was definitely a series I went into with pretty high expectations.
Exactly. And we should also mention that A Silent Voice is nominated for this year's Eisner Award in the Best U.S. Edition of International Material Asia category. So again, we went into this with really high hopes. So now the question becomes, now that you and I have read A Silent Voice, Does the narrative itself live up to the hype you and I experienced?
No, I wouldn't say so. And we talked about it briefly before we started recording, but there were just certain elements of the story that I thought were. I think your complaint was that it was a little too decompressed. I think I had the kind of opposite complaint where certain scenes or certain narratives, the arcs of certain characters were felt very truncated to me, where they weren't brought to a satisfying conclusion. And I wondered to you aloud whether or not this series might have been canceled, because it does have that, it has the ending of kind of a planned and intended ending, but the way it just kind of unsatisfyingly addresses certain concerns kind of gives that impression that it was wrapped up rather hastily.
It's interesting that you mentioned this, because I was doing a little research on Oima, because I have not been familiar with any of her other work. Mm-hmm. And I did see that she has a new series that's going to be coming out soon. And I can't remember the title of it, but it's a fantasy from what I remember. Mm-hmm. But I was looking on various websites, and there's one site called myanimelist.net. Mm-hmm. that has, I guess, a profile of a lot of mangaka, and she's listed there. She's relatively young. She's 27. Mm-hmm. And under the comments section that I guess readers of this site can go in if they're registered and make comments about their experience reading the stuff. It's interesting that a number of them have pointed out their dissatisfaction with the ending, even though they like the series. I'm looking at this page right now, and one respondent says, "Give us a better ending, please." Another writes, "You can't end a manga like that. I want to see more." And then a third one, I really love Koi na Katachi, I guess the Japanese title, but the ending was a bit disappointing. We are hoping for an alternate ending, though. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that after you said that you weren't that thrilled with the ending, you thought that it came to kind of a quick fishtail wrap-up. Mm-hmm. I found this site where others were saying the same thing. But we should also point out, as you and I were discussing right before we hit the record button, that even though we may have some issues with this series, we nonetheless like it.
I wasn't put off by it, and there's certainly elements of it that I enjoyed quite a bit. We briefly mentioned that it does address it has a deaf character, and it addresses it really does heavily revolve around that deaf character and her disability, and so the things that Oima does with that character, and particularly the lettering of there's a scene in the first volume where she sings and as part of a school choir, and the character's singing is rendered as these musical notes, but hers are kind of like crooked and they're placed very askew, so as to represent her kind of like her inability to sing really, or her tone deafness, which I thought was really clever. And then I was a little disappointed to see that they don't really do anything, or Oima doesn't really do much with that until I think it's in volume 6, where each of the characters kind of gets their own chapter told from their perspective, where the deaf character, Shoko Nishimiya, is we see things from her perspective, and she can kind of read lips, but not very well, and it's difficult if people don't enunciate. And so the lettering, all of the words are sliced in half, and so you can just kind of barely make out what's being said, but you have to kind of labor to do it. And I thought that was really interesting and really clever, because it's you don't see a lot of visualizations of what that experience must be like.
Right.
And so I thought technically that was clever and interesting, and there are certain points where she or another character uses sign language that I really liked the way that Oima renders the signing very quickly. It's almost like what something like Masashi Kishimoto would do in Naruto when a character is doing some ninja move and they're moving their hands super quickly. I thought that was
sound effects.
Right, yeah, and I thought that was cool, and I like that Oima did that. But it's just one of those things I think in the series where it's really promising, and there's these really interesting moments that I just wish Oima had capitalized on a little more. Because when they show up when she does those little things, I was really impressed by them. But it's not, and so I liked the series, but it was unsatisfying for me in a number of ways.
Right. Now, let's back up a bit and set a premise for this series. And I don't believe we mentioned the publisher. These 7 volumes are published through Kodansha Comics. And, we've been discussing quite a number of Kodansha titles over the past several months. And this is another one worth checking out. But basically, A Silent Voice is about, as you mentioned, a young deaf woman by the name of Shoko. And in this first volume, she becomes a new student at an elementary school where a young boy, Shoya Ashita, attends. And the thing about Shoya is that, at least in elementary school, he's a bully. He's a kid who likes to tempt fate. He has a couple of friends where they like to do daredevil stunts to see what it's like, in many ways kind of endangering his life. But he is also insensitive to many people around him. And so when Shoko shows up at the school, he sees her as an easy target. So most of this first volume is devoted to him being a bully. To the point that he causes her to leave that school because of the life that he's created there for her. It's not something that she can put up with anymore. And this includes something as nasty as taking her hearing aid out and breaking it or tossing it, throwing it away. I mean, this is really a nasty guy. I couldn't help but just feel anger at the character Shoya in that first volume. Now, by the time we get to the end of this first volume, he has grown up a little. He's in high school. He's in his last year of high school, I believe. And he wants to make things up with Shoko. So he seeks her out, and he wants to apologize and try to make amends. And that's basically the setup of the remainder of this of the 7 volumes that we have, or the 6 volumes that we have after that in the 7-volume series, where Shoya tries to make things up to Shoko, and part of trying to make amends is getting her, Shoko, introduced to a lot of the friends from elementary school that became distant from Shoko. And Shoya feels it's largely because of him that the other kids in elementary school really didn't take to her. So he tries to get Shoko and other people together, like Naoka, who also has her problems as a bully, Miki, Miyoko, and then there are other characters who become involved along the way. A young boy by the name, kind of a nerd, Tomohiro, becomes a friend of Shoya's. And in fact, it's that friendship that leads to much of the action in the remaining 6 volumes, and that is Tomohiro wanting to make a movie and pulling all of the friends into it to help. So the making of the movie itself becomes a binding experience, and when this binding starts to fray in chapter, I think it's 5 and then into 6, we see the friends break up, and that causes a lot of problems that are ultimately resolved in one form or another in the final volume. But then there are other people like Satoshi who become a part of this group as well. Satoshi wasn't a part of the elementary school group. So anyway, that's the setup that we have in this story. And if I could describe A Silent Voice in one sentence, it would be Shoya trying to make up or trying to make amends to Shoko and taking a hell of a long time to do it.
Yeah, it's primarily concerned with I think Shoyo trying to. It's very strange because it's a very strange story to read and to see these people so concerned with with wanting to be friends with the people they were friends with at 12, which is really the kind of dramatic crux of this, is getting this class full of students who knew each other at 12 and who drifted apart back together. I don't think it's something you'd see in Western media, but it is something. It's the kind of thing you do see in like I think in Japanese media a lot, in things like visual novels or I was like halfway through the series and I was really struck by how much it reminded me of, the first 2 or 3 hours of playing Kingdom Hearts 2, which hopefully one of our listeners will understand what I'm talking about. But yeah, it's I'm trying to think of how to describe it, because it's something that feels so small. It feels like if you told me that story that this is what it's about these people who are trying to get back to with the friends they had when they were 12, I would think that's just such like a small, almost petty kind of narrative.
But see, that's the weird thing. In many ways, these guys really weren't friends back in elementary school.
Some of them weren't.
Right, and even the ones who knew each other in elementary school, they weren't friends, because Naoka is rather nasty, and I don't think that there was any time that she was nice to Shoko. Or even Miyoko and Miki, who is, Little Miss Perfect, very, very intelligent, gets all the good grades. She seemed to be distant from everyone. So I think that in elementary school, when they were that young, they were disconnected. So they're trying to create friendship that in many ways didn't exist. But for me, the important part of this is they're getting back together all because of Shoya. In his attempts to make amends to Shoko. So, and which is ironic in that when he was young, Showa was the one who was in essence driving people away and distancing people one from the other. But yet he's the one later in life who is trying to pull everyone together as a way of making things up to Shoko, to give her the kind of friendship that he feel like he deprived her when she was about 12 years old. Right.
And I think Shoko plays an interesting role because in the narrative, she's kind of this impetus to, we find out within the first volume that Shoya has kind of resolved to kill himself. And then he sees Shoko and he feels this kind of like drive to continue living. And so she plays this really weird role in the story because she holds such importance for the character of Shoya, and she drives the narrative, and her kind of presence, and Shoya trying to be friends with her and trying to draw other people to her is really the crux of the story. But at the same time, she's kind of denied an interiority. We never really get a sense of what she's thinking and how she's feeling. And part of that is the character and her Naoka is repeatedly gets mad at her for not being kind of emotionally honest, and Shoko's sister Yuzuri feels similarly that she never really understands how Shoko is feeling. But the result is this character who she's kind of, even at the end of the story, she's very much like a cipher of a character. We really never get a sense of who she is, and except in these moments where she does things like blurt out that she loves Shoya, which is never really capitalized on. Is one of those things that Oima fails to kind of do anything with. But what did you think of Shoko's role in the story? Because she's both a main character and a kind of MacGuffin. So she's weird like that. But what did you get from her?
Yeah, I agree with you in that we really don't have much of any access to her interior, right? I mean, every now and again, a character, and usually it's Shoya, who will speculate what must she be feeling. And many times it's also with Uzuru, her sister, who tells us, maybe indirectly, what Shoko may be going through. But we really don't know, and so in many ways she remains a cipher throughout this series. Now, the first 5 volumes are almost entirely focalized through Shoya, because he's the one who's telling this story, and he's the one who's kind of agonizing over everything that's going on with Shoko and the others. And so a moment ago when I said, he takes a hell of a long time to try to make amends, what I mean by that is we are privy, beginning in, let's say, toward the end of the first volume, of what Shoya does throughout. I should have done something different. Oh, I treated Shoko wrong, and now I got to make up for it. And what do I do? How do I go about this? And so I think access to his interiority is fine, but after a while, I was getting a little tired of his emotional wranglings. I thought, just do something already and quit thinking about it. Okay, it's almost as if we have to witness Hamlet unable to make a decision on steroids, right? Do I or don't I? Do I or don't I? And I felt that with the character Shoya, is that he was almost wallowing in his indecision or his attempts to try to make amends. On the other hand, I do have to say that I think that Oima does a good job of showing the emotional dynamics and consequences of bullying. Not the victims of bullies so much as the bullies themselves. Now, I'm not suggesting that Oima empathizes with the bully, but one of the things she does do is to show the human side of the bully himself in this case. But as I mentioned with Naoka, we have a female bully. We get to see what bullying does to the bully, and that's usually a side of that equation we don't see played out in media. And so that, I really liked it. At times I did feel that there was a little too much wallowing in the turmoil, but even given that, I appreciated what Oima was doing. But getting back to your initial question, yeah, I agree. I do think that Shoko is quite a bit of a mystery. But what we know of her, I felt that even her attempts or inactions became a little too much at times.
Yeah, it's and that's, I think, was my next question for you is, I mentioned that she kind of blurts out and expresses that she is in love with Shoya, and another character, Naoka. It's explicit in later volumes, but it's pretty clear from her initial appearances that she has kind of romantic feelings for Shoya and feels that she's competing with Shoko. But because of what we just talked about, the fact that Shoko isn't emotionally present in the story in the way that I think I would have liked her to be, and the fact that much of the narrative is given over to Shoya as kind of like soliloquy, kind of wallowing. It is really difficult to buy the romantic angle. I really couldn't. I was really surprised when Shoko makes that declaration, and and even when Naoka makes that declaration, looking at the story, looking at what we see of these characters, it's you really never get the sense that there is that emotional connection, that there's that desire to have a romantic relationship between these characters. What did you think of that kind of detail? Was that something that played for you, or was it surprising and kind of out of the blue? Or
actually, that did play for me, and I liked that because I felt that became another engine for the narrative to power itself. And when we get toward the very end of Volume 3, when Shoko reveals her feelings for Shoya, And I think that this is a very powerful scene. He's about to ride away, and it's not often that Shoko attempts to speak. But here she does, and she says, Yasho, which sometimes he's called, I love mu. And he goes, what? And she repeats herself, I love mu. And he doesn't understand her, but he hears the mu part and thinks she means moon. And so he says, oh, the moon. And he looks up, and when he does, she nods her head, yes. That's what she meant. Although we know that's not what she meant. Now, and that's the tail end of Volume 3. And so from there on, the question becomes, at what point will Shoya realize that not only that Shoko's feelings for him, but that his feelings for her are of a romantic nature, because he doesn't seem to be aware of that throughout most of this series. And then you add in the complication in this triangle, if you want to call it that, of Naoka, and I think that goes a long way of helping to drive this narrative. So I really liked that part of this story.
I mean, I agree with you that scene at the end of Volume 3 is, I think it's played very well, and it is resonant, and the kind of next couple scenes where Shoko reacts to not being understood I think it's a really dramatic, powerful scene. But just for me, there wasn't, I don't know, maybe it was because I feel, like you, once that scene happened, I kind of expected there to be this kind of shift in the narrative, but there's really not, and Oima doesn't really, it's like a subject she doesn't go back to really in a satisfying way, I don't think. And so it's not really clear to me if they are in a romantic relationship, if Shoya ever becomes aware of Shoko's feelings. But then another reservation I had about it was that it is, all of these stories, these friendships between, men and women or boys and girls, they almost always end up in these romantic relationships. And so I was kind of looking forward to a story in which, these, a man and a woman or a teenage boy and teenage girl, were able to maintain a platonic friendship and just be friends, because it's something that I think, we see in the world a lot. You see a lot of men and women that are just friends, but you don't really see it in fiction. And so I was kind of looking forward to a story like that. And then it kind of ended up in the usual space. So that was just another thing I had reservations about, was that I don't think Oima really capitalizes on that romantic arc, but she gets into it enough that it was kind of, it was disappointing for me, I think.
Well, let me ask you this to see if this is fair or not. Do you think that the way that Oima handled that relationship in ways that you don't necessarily appreciate, do you think that's a function of her age, the artist's age? Because, I said that she's 27 now, but when this was originally serialized, I mean, she was quite a bit younger. And I can just see that a young creator may fall back on, let's say, more formulaic workings of boy-girl or man-woman relationships, and not problematize it as much. So I'm wondering if that might be the case, or maybe I'm being unfair to Oima by suggesting that age came into play here.
I mean, there's really no way of knowing. I think the longer an artist kind of works at, their art and hones their craft, obviously they're going to, or hopefully they're going to, think about these little details and the implications of these little details, and
the more they'll become hard and grizzled.
Yeah, but and I mean, I think it is fair to say that that's a product of practice of writing these kinds of stories over and over again, thinking through these stories, reading these stories and realizing that you're dissatisfied with the kind of tropes, and trying to do something different in your own work, and so I think you can certainly make the case that were she telling the same sort of story after having, told it several times? She may be telling it differently. She may be, changing the details. She may be subverting some of these tropes a little. But I think it's more likely that this is just the common story. This is what everyone falls back on, and it's even people who do work at it for long periods of time, and they tell these kinds of stories multiple times throughout their career. That's no guarantee that they'll ever kind of realize that they're repeating themselves, or they're kind of regurgitating these themes or ideas or narratives or whatever. So it's possible that maybe she'll come back to tell a story like this, and she'll tell it differently. But there's no really guarantee that she would have done a better job if she was 10 or 20 years older, or a different job, I should say, if she were older. So,
let me be clear, because when I said something about age, I didn't mean necessarily purely a function of how young she is, but young in age in terms of experience as a writer, and also life experience. I mean, those things go hand in hand. So I would just think that a more mature writer, and by more mature, I mean someone who's been doing this for longer and who has more life experiences, a lot of the gloss of the romance may have been worn off, or at least put into certain contexts. So that's what I was suggesting.
Yeah, I think it is fair to speculate that if she were more experienced, if she were a more experienced writer or cartoonist, obviously the story would certainly be different. It's unclear if that detail would be handled differently, or if she would, maybe take her time to flesh out the relationship a little bit more. But certainly, obviously the more time you spend writing and telling stories and accruing these life experiences, you're going to tell these narratives differently. So it is possible, and I think it's fair to speculate that a more experienced cartoonist would tell the story differently. Whether or not they would shore up the things that I have reservations about is, that's kind of a crapshoot.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. What did you think about the complications to this storyline that occur in Volume 5? Because there's more than one, and these are rather serious for the direction that the last two volumes take.
I'm trying to think, is Volume 5 the one where the Shoya get hospitalized in that volume? Is that what you're talking about?
It's right before that, because basically what happens, what I'm referring to here, is in the last half of Volume 5, something happens with Shoya and his reaction and the way what he says to one or two people kind of causes an avalanche, so to speak, where all the friends fall apart, right? And so this group that had been cohesive for quite a while all of a sudden breaks up. As a result, Shoko feels that she's the reason that Shoya acted the way that he did, which caused everyone to break up. And so she takes responsibility, and just as we saw earlier, Shoya wanting to kill himself, now Shoko wants to kill herself, but Shoya prevents this from happening, and in doing so, he becomes injured himself and is unconscious for that next volume, 6. And so, it's in Chapter 5 that all of these complications occur. The breaking up of the friends because of something that Shoya does, Shoko's reaction to that, and where Shoya ends up in the hospital.
Yeah, I think as far as the series goes, that sequence of events is pretty dramatic, particularly Shoya being injured and being unconscious for a significant portion of the 6th volume. But I mean, just thinking about that the scene kind of preceding Shoko's attempted suicide, and where Shoya kind of gets into a fight with some of the other people on this project they're doing, this film they're making. Thinking about that now, I think I think the biggest problem I had with the series is that the stakes are so low, and I think, I mean, you asking about that, it really just, occurred to me that that's kind of the problem I had with the series, is that it's played so massively, like everything we're seeing is so monumentally important, but the stakes are, at the end of the day, so incredibly low and penny ante that it is. I think that was the thing that I wasn't able to articulate. I didn't have the word for it, but yeah, it's petty almost. The narrative and the drama is, for me, because it is they're children. They're 17-year-olds. They're 17 years old. They're children. These are the things they're doing, the things they're experiencing, the fights they're having, are the things that teenagers fight about. They're not that big a deal. People either get over it or they don't get over it, and that's life. It's not something to the reactions, or at least for me, the reactions that people are having to these scenes and to these events and to these conversations is so disproportionately big to what is actually happened.
Okay, I see where you're going here, and I see your point. But let me ask you this. You're right to point out that the characters here are primarily 17 years old, right? So the things that they're going through seem grandiose to them, but as an older reader, they seem, and you use the word petty. But let me ask you this. If you slipped into the skin, again, of a 16 and 17-year-old, wouldn't this seem much more grandiose? I mean, wouldn't the problems that they're experiencing seem, have more gravitas and have more impact than they would being, 20, 30, 40 years old and reading this?
Yeah, that was actually something that occurred to me while I was saying that, that Oima does kind of play it like, when you are 17 years old, these things do feel so big, and that they are the maybe it's an inappropriate reaction that these characters are having, but it's the kind of common reaction that a teenager would have. And I think that's fair to point out, and I think that's a fair defense of the way Oima plays these scenes and these characters and this dialogue. But for me, because I'm an adult reader, because or maybe even not because I'm an adult reader, but just because I'm kind of, if I saw this happening to a group of people I didn't actually know that well, I would say, they're, even when I was 17, I probably would have said, that's childish, that's immature. And so, I think that's definitely like a viable defense of the way Oima tells the story and kind of renders these characters. But I don't know, for me, if that necessarily makes it more interesting. I think this still the problem I have persists, that it's just, for me, it's not dramatic in the way that I am being told that it's dramatic.
Right.
And I think that's the real problem, regardless of why it is that way, because of the age of the characters relative to my age, or because I don't really know these characters that well. The result is the same, that I do feel like these conflicts are kind of overblown, and because of that, it is unsatisfying on a dramatic level.
Right, because then the question becomes: do these kind of teenage dramas make for good narrative? Or maybe another way of looking at this is, do these dramas make for good narrative to particular audiences? And I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind as well, because, did Oima write this with a much younger audience than the two of us in mind? And if so, then this book probably resonates in ways that with those readers that it wouldn't, let's say, with you or with me in certain ways. I mean, I think I'm trying to see this from the perspective of what I think may be the intended audience, and not just people who are 16 and 17, but people who can empathize and still remember what it's like to be 16 and 17 and deal with these kind of quote-unquote crises. Because to them, it's not a quote-unquote crises, they're crises.
I think that's a fair point. Just looking at its publication history, it was originally serialized in Weekly Shonen magazine, and so its intended audience probably would have been young boys, even just a couple years younger than Shoya is in the series. So 13 to kind of 15 year old boys. So I think that is fair to keep in mind the audience, and that I think this was intended to be received by an audience for whom these problems would have been more immediate and probably more dramatic. But it's a fair qualification, but it doesn't make me like the series anymore.
Okay. And that's fair enough. It's going to be interesting to see next month when they award the Eisners what those who voted feel this, how this resonates compared to some of the other contenders in that category. And by the way, some of the other nominees for this year's Best U.S. Edition of International Material Asia include some titles that we're very familiar with. Assassination Classroom, which we discussed several months ago. A Bride's Story, which I haven't read. Urasawa's Master Keaton. Mizuki's Showa, the volume 53 through 1989, and then Matsumoto's Sunny, volume 5. So a lot of good contenders for this year.
Yeah, if I had any faith in the Eisners, I would say that Sunny would win, because
I knew you'd say that.
It's the best,
and we still need to discuss Sunny.
I think we're still waiting on the last volume.
So when any word on when that's coming out?
Probably, but I haven't seen any. But yes, we do. When that comes out, we need to talk about the whole series, because I will effusively praise Taiyo Matsumoto.
Well, let's start discussing something that actually has come out, and the full title is... Oh, by the way, before I give the full title, which we did at the top of the show, but we should mention at this point in the podcast episode, if you're easily offended by certain language, especially language that deals with parts of the female anatomy, then this may not be for you. So we just want to give a little warning here. Because this is where things get a little more explicit. Although, I'm perfectly fine with this, as I'm sure you are as well.
Yeah, I think the author of the book we would talk about would say they need to stay. If people are uncomfortable, they need to stay. Because,
and it shouldn't be shocking.
Yes, they need to learn. They need to learn to be comfortable with these words.
That's right. So the whole title of this book that we're about to discuss is "What is Obscenity? The Story of a Good-for-Nothing Artist and Her Pussy." And this is by Rokudenashiko, which is the pen name of Megumi Igarashi. And this book came out back in, I believe, May from Koyama Press. So this is a very different kind of manga, and not just because of its subject matter.
Yeah, it's, I think even when we were talking about whether or not to do this book, your reservation was like, does this even fall under what we talk about? Because I would say a good, maybe quarter of the book is given over to contextualizing information about Japanese penal system, quotes from Igarashi's lawyer, pictures of the work that Igarashi was doing that kind of precipitated the events depicted in the book. So it is this interesting mix of nonfiction manga with information to help us to paint a broader picture of what exactly is occurring.
Right.
And,
Yeah, and so, as you pointed out, there's a lot in this book that is not manga. They're photographs, there are text-only sections that give definitions or histories. At one point, we even get excerpts from an interview with a filmmaker. So okay, let's set the stage here. Most of what we find in this book, what is Obscenity, is what happened to Rokudenashiko, and actually the word Rokudenashi means good for nothing. So Rokudenashiko is good for nothing woman or bad woman, I guess you could say. But she goes by that name, and purposefully so. So what happened back in July 2014 was she was arrested in Japan for indecency, for obscenity, for distributing obscenity digitally through the internet. Basically, she was breaking a few obscenity laws that are still on the books in Japan. And what she had done to break those laws is to engage in what she calls dekoman, or art dealing with her manko, or pussy. And what she did initially was to make an impression of it and make a mold, and then to start creating objects based on this mold. So she would take the mold of her pussy and make it into, for instance, let's say a case for a cell phone. She even made a really interesting, and I want one of these, a little animated like character, or at least a cartoon type character called Manko-chan, or Miss Manko, or Miss Pussy, if you want to translate it. And then I think what got her the most attention, especially with the police, was that she started a campaign, on a crowdfunding campaign, where she wanted enough funds where she could take the image of her pussy and blow it up and make a large mold of it, and then make it into a boat, a form to put on top of a kayak. And of course, she's doing this not just for the hell of it, but she's doing it to make a point, right? To point out that there's nothing bad and shameful about female body parts, just as there's nothing bad or shameful about male body parts. Because she points out in this book more than a couple of times, it's okay in Japanese society when they honor the phallus, right? But when it comes to the vagina, that's something that people don't want a part of. And if you want to discuss that, even say the word manko, you're either a pervert or you're a woman who's horny and just wants to get laid. In other words, you're loose.
And she, there's scenes in this manga where she recounts, reciting her statements in court, where she insisted on using the word manko, but the judge wouldn't let her. She had to change every instance of the word manko to genitals, or female genitals, or clinical language like that, before he would even allow her to proceed. And so this is this kind of phobia of even the word is something that I think Igarashi does a good job of rendering as institutional as something that's enforced by these legitimating bodies of
patriarchal culture. Yeah,
right. Yeah, it's a really interesting book, particularly for someone who isn't that familiar with things like Japanese obscenity laws, with the kind of intricacies and nuances of Japanese culture or the Japanese penal system. That this was, it was kind of eye-opening.
Exactly. Another word that she uses at times to substitute for manko is middle. And in fact, on her crowdfunding campaign, its title was something like, I want to make a boat out of an image of my middle, or something to that effect. So she has, even in doing the crowdfunding that got her the most attention, that eventually landed her in jail, not once, but twice, she had to be careful with her language. But the irony is, her being careful with the language still got her arrested.
Yeah, her case is interesting, because even after she was, I think on her initial arrest, she was found not guilty, but then she was arrested again, found guilty and had to pay a fine, like a pretty hefty fine. So yeah, it's.
Yeah, she was arrested twice, both in 2014, July and then December.
November. And Christmas. The second one was Christmas Eve.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Happy holidays.
Yeah, it's wasn't a good experience, I assume.
No, but the manga that we have in this book, What is Obscenity, is primarily about that first arrest. Mm-hmm. And in fact, as you pointed out, probably about a third of this book is not manga, but the other 2/3 are. And those 2/3 are broken down into, in essence, 3 different stories. Mm-hmm. The first one, and this makes up the majority of the book, it's, I don't know, it's a little over half, I guess, is the, 18-chapter series, What is Obscenity? And then the subtitle is How I Became a So-Called Artist. Mm-hmm. And that part runs toward the beginning up to page 113. And then later on we have a shorter 6-chapter story called Why I Became a Manko Artist. And then at the very end of the book, we have, I guess, about a 10-page story that's in color. The others aren't, called This Is My Story. And the "my" refers to Manka-chan. So the pussy, Manka-chan, is the one telling this story about mm-hmm. herself. Mm-hmm. So that's really interesting. But it's this first story, the longest one, What is Obscenity? How I Became a So-Called Artist, that is the core of this book. And this, as well as the other strips, originally ran serialized in the magazine Shukan Kyobi, which translates into Weekly Friday. Mm-hmm. And that was a magazine. Or that is a magazine. And
if I remember correctly, they make a particular point to... it's like a leftist magazine that's really critical of...
Right.
Prime Minister, I think he's still Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, mm-hmm. and they even speculate that Igarashi was just kind of collateral damage. They really wanted to arrest the publisher. I think I'm looking for the text right now. Either a publisher or like a journalist at this magazine who was kind of like leading the discursive charge against the conservative Abe. Mm-hmm. So it's a very political book, but its politics are very particular to Japan.
Exactly. And this could be a political book that was very serious and even angry, and I don't think I would have enjoyed it near as much as I did. But mm-hmm. for me, what really makes this, outside of the controversy surrounding this, is Rokudenashiko's sense of humor, because she has an incredible sense of humor. She takes all of this seriously, but she's able to put it within a context where she can laugh at it at the same time that she, points out to us that, this is nothing for us to laugh at. Yet by laughing at it, I'm helping to take that sting out of it, not only for herself, but also for for the way that Manko is used in her culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned in an interview that's in the back of the book with Sion Sono, who's a director who's directed things like Why Don't You Play in Hell, Tokyo Tribe, which is based on manga, and Suicide Club is probably one people in America are most familiar with, but. He says it's really great that in your manga, after the police confiscated after the police confiscated your manga, you find yourself saying Manko even more. If the police came into my house, I'd go into a total panic, but you remain so calm about it. And she responds, not at all. I never imagined I'd be arrested, but 90% of me was just thinking, what an amazing story this was going to make. I was so excited, my hands were shaking. So even the real Igarashi is very similar to the kind of her manga counterpart. She's just like chomping at the bits to tell the story, because it is so bizarre, it's so strange, particularly for a Western audience. I mentioned that it's a particularly Japanese book because of the events that it depicts and the kind of intricacies and nuances that precede precipitate those events.
Yeah.
But that makes it kind of like farcical and very strange and comical for someone like me or you who for whom these obscenity laws are so draconian and bizarre and almost Kafkaesque, you know. So it's a really interesting book. It's a really interesting book.
Yeah. You know, and something that you pointed out, for me at least, really does add to the comedy of this story, and that is Rokudenashiko, or Igarashi's, sense of what will make a good story, right? Because, you know, as she tells us, and as you pointed out, when she's arrested, she's thinking, you know, this is going to make a good manga. But even before that, when she first begins to make a mold of her pussy, one of the reasons why she does it is she's thinking to herself, this is going to make a good manga.
Yeah, she. We find out later that you know, the first time she made a mold of her vagina was after she got, I think it was labia reduction surgery, and she got it so that she could write a manga about the surgery and about the experience. So she's one of those people who is always on the prowl to write, and very strange. Well, not strange. That's maybe not the right word for it, but
not the usual.
Not the usual, uncommon, surprising manga with surprising subject matter, shall we say.
Now, you mentioned the labia reduction, and this is what we get in this second story, the 6th chapter narrative, Why I Became a Manko Artist. And I found it interesting that when she's having that operation, she gets a local anesthesia, and she's glad because that way she can stay awake so she can remember what's going on, because this would make a good manga story.
Yeah, she mentions that I think it's that same story where she talks about kind of discovering manga and discovering that she enjoys manga, and she realizes that it's kind of the only thing that she knows how to do. It's the only thing she really is good at. And in a scene like that, where she is like, oh, you know, this is really, you know, sucks, but it's good because it lets me, you know, recall the experience more fully, and I can tell when I tell this story, I can add more details and stuff like that. You know, it's in moments like that where you really do see her passion for what she does, and kind of almost unhealthy passion for what she does. This dedication to, you know, to see every instance, every time, God, what am I trying to say? Every opportunity to tell a story, to tell a weird story, to tell a funny story, she kind of relishes. And
right. Now, also in this story, Why I Became a Manko Artist, we find out that even before her interest in Manko art, or Dekoman, she is mangaka. She is a manga artist. And as you pointed out, it's something that she can do and she feels very adept at. One of the only things she feels really good at. So she's a manga artist and has some things published. Now here's my question to you, and this is something that you and I, you know, started to discuss before we started recording today. I don't know of anything else that Igarashi has done in terms of manga. And I was even trying to look up some of her other manga, but I can't find anything.
Yeah, I you know, we talked briefly before, and I had the same problem. I wouldn't even know where to look for something like that, because it does seem, at least to me, that a lot of her work was appeared in you know, it's not going to sell, you know, 1 million copies, right? It's more kind of niche and slightly more obscure, and it seemed to me that it was stuff that hadn't been collected, so I don't even know where.
And it's not going to be translated,
right? Well, you know, if this proves popular, you know, you never know, but
yeah. Well, okay,
it hasn't been.
Right. And now, okay, what you just said, if this becomes popular, because this book is only about a month old now, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's my question to you. Igarashi is now known for this, for her work on with Manko, Dekoman. And even if this does generate in, let's say, the English-speaking world, more interest in her work, whether this is Koyama or some other publisher, what if they do go back, even if they do go back and get some of her older manga and publish that as a collection, I feel as momentous of an event this was in her life, as defining of a moment of what happened in 2014, especially with her arrest, that this is going to be what she's known for, and that there's no way for her to escape this for the rest of her life. And maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. I was thinking in speculating on this issue, is this something that Igarashi is going to be known for forever and nothing else? The situation of Scott McCloud, right? Now, Scott McCloud is known as the writer of Understanding Comics. Now, he obviously did a lot of work before Understanding Comics, and he's done a lot of work since Understanding Comics, but he's always going to be known as the man who wrote Understanding Comics. And I think we even asked him, Scott McCloud, about this when we had him on the podcast last year, is, the gigantic shadow that Understanding Comics casts on his career. And he admits that that's the case. Maybe at some point he'll get out from under that shadow, but who knows? I don't think he will. And again, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. So in coming back to Igarashi and what is Obscenity and what she does with Manko art, I'm wondering if this is going to define her for the rest of her life, even if she did something completely different later in terms of her art.
I think... there are a couple things. I think that the sense that I get from this work is that, as an artist moving forward, this is kind of what she is interested in doing. This is kind of the subject matter she's interested in covering, at least for the foreseeable future, particularly the kind of social function that it has, the kind of normalization of Manko and vaginas and female genitals, and so that seems to be the kind of milieu she's interested in continuing. So right now it's unclear whether or not she wants to even attempt to do something different, radical or otherwise. So I think she would. I think she would kind of relish the attention this has gotten, because it brings attention to this kind of this normalization that she is trying, this de-erotization of the vagina that she is trying to affect. But I think with you that it's unclear whether or not, if she did attempt to do something radically different, if people would stop thinking of her as, the Manko artist,
Right. I have no feelings one way or another as to whether this is a good or bad thing. I'm just saying that this has had such a defining effect on her in her career. I don't see how something like this, a shadow this big, could ever recede.
Right, and I feel similarly. I do feel similarly, and it's I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bad thing. I think it can be debilitating when the artist themselves doesn't want to be defined by that. But it seems like Igarashi is comfortable and enjoys that the attention she's getting for this work. So in this case, I wouldn't say it's a bad thing. I think it's probably good, because it definitely plays into what she is pursuing. But I think, you mentioned Scott McCloud, and if, worse comes to worse, if Igarashi continues to be a popular artist and people are hungry for her work, simply because it has her name on it, she can continue to be defined as the manga artist and continue to be thought of as the manga artist and referred to as the manga artist, but she can still continue to do other kinds of work and profit greatly. You mentioned McLeod has done work after understanding comics, and even the sculptor from was that 2 years already ago?
No, not quite. It came out last year.
Okay. But last year it made some end of the year lists. It was very well received by not everyone, but by a lot of people, and it sold very well. And so, Scott McCloud, he will probably be continued to be referred to as the understanding comic guy and thought of as that. But his name on a book, he can still continue to do whatever kind of work he wants, and people will still continue to buy it because his name is on it. And so it is, being immensely popular for this one thing is bad in some ways, because it does kind of box you into this definition of what people think of you as and expect from you. But it can also allow you to be financially successful in other endeavors.
Right. But it just seems to me, though, that other manga that she creates, it's probably going to have to be about Manko.
Right. And I would agree with that, regardless of, if she decided for her next project to do something radically different, I agree that it would be difficult for her to kind of shirk the reputation and the expectation that people have of her and her work that she's created, and that, well, not even that she's created, but that has been created for her because of the attention that this legal case received. So yeah, I agree with you that I don't see how she would be able to do something that would be more defining than this.
Yeah. Although if she does want to try something completely different, I'll read it.
I think she's got a great sense of the way she draws her aesthetic isn't the kind of thing I typically like, but I like the way that she tells a nonfiction story. I like the way that she, I think she has a great sense of humor, and she renders that humor really well in the comics form, which I think is difficult to do. So I would definitely be keen to check out other works of her as well if a press or another publisher expressed interest in translating and importing those works. Yeah,
and apparently the reality-based manga is something that defined her writing even before all of her work on Manko.
Yeah, that seemed to be the kind of genre that she had the most success in. Was nonfiction. So. Yeah.
But yeah, I really enjoyed What is Obscenity. It's a different book. It's an intriguing book. It's one that could be controversial, but however you feel about what Rokudenashiko is doing, you'll be entertained by this, definitely.
Right, and it is important to note that this book was published by Koyama Press, but it was published in collaboration with Massive, which is the collaborative effort by Ann Ishii and Graham Colbeans, who did. I don't know if Graham was involved in the Passion of Gengoro Tagami that Picture Box put out, but they were both involved in the massive collection of gay erotic manga that Fantagraphics put out, I think 2 years ago, and it seems like they are, pressing on and working with various publishers to publish books like Massive, like What is Obscenity, that kind of run the gamut of exposing and subverting and addressing the sexual and gender norms of Japan that Western readers may not have much engagement with or experience with or knowledge about. And so I think it's important to put out it's important to point out the effort that they have put in editing and helping to put together this volume. And I hope that they continue to put out work like this, because I like when manga editors like Ryan Holmberg or these two, I like that I can look forward to anything that they are involved with, because it's going to be interesting, it's going to be aesthetically engaging, it's going to be educational, it's going to show me manga that I've never experienced with. So yeah, I hope we get more work from Rokudenashiko, and I hope we get more work that's published in collaboration with Massive.
Mm-hmm. Well, we had a great month discussing two very interesting and different titles. We started off with Yoshitoki Oima's A Silent Voice, the 7-volume series. And then we concluded with Rokudenashiko's What is Obscenity? Mm-hmm. So two really fascinating titles. And if you want to find other manga that is fascinating, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. In fact, if you go to dcbservice.com right now and do a search on Silent Voice, you'll find that you can get, I think it's about all of the volumes of A Silent Voice at 30% off of the cover price. So that's only $7.69 a volume. You really can't beat those prices. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what kind of manga you're going to be reading, and also what kind of manga we should be reading and discussing on the show. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe, which is really easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also email us at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me specifically at Shea@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, where can they email you?
At Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over the social media sphere, including Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. You can listen to us on Spotify. And if you're an Android user, find us on Google Play Music. But you can always find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, by going to the website, comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways of getting in touch with us.
That's right. One day I think we'll have to institute carrier pigeons to get every way of contacting us. But
yeah, that's a future project. But I wanted to let you know that I just recently inherited a fax machine.
Oh,
because I know you've made jokes about that.
Yeah, I was thinking I can't make another fax machine joke. I have to switch it up a bit for the regular listeners.
That's right. I don't know if I'll set it up as a fax machine because it also does copies and whatnot. But I do have one just in case I'm in the mood to start accepting communication via fax.
Yeah, that would be in keeping with our subject matter, because fax machines are weirdly popular in Japan.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, from what I understand, they are still very, very common in offices.
Well, that's something for us to look into maybe in the months to come. Maybe discuss fax manga.
I assure you there is probably a fax manga.
Yeah, there is. We'll have to look for that. Well, until next month, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you later.